So, good afternoon. What I wanted to spend the next half hour is telling you a little bit about a book that I just finished with David Collender. Some of you may know him. And so please don't take, those of you who've written a book think you're very excited when you finished it. So take it as the excitement of sharing how it's finished rather than a plug for the book. So that's really not the intention. And it is about complexity and public policy, and which is, for me, rather extraordinary in the sense that David and I have very different backgrounds. I am a theoretical physicist by training, and actually finished my studies doing an agent-based model of the universe, looking at how you could get to how a fractal distribution of galaxies could be generated out of a uniform background as an emergent process. So I had a very early induction into this stuff, and I always kept an interest all during my career, which I spent most of the time in industry. I spent 25 years working in various companies, and the last couple of years I've been in Oxford and writing and talking about things. But essentially a background with a real keen interest in complexity and systems, but with an industrial career. And I ran into David at a conference, and he is he's an economist, actually a historian of economics in many ways. He's an observer of how economics works. And we were at this conference, and we both were sort of slightly puzzled at the way the dialogue went, and we happened to be on the same plane out of Berlin, it was at the time. And it was 3 years ago, and we shared all this conversation. We said, well, we should really write a book about this. And it was about complexity, the complexity frame for public policy. And I thought this was particularly important, but never expected anyone else to be interested. So I was rather thrilled when I found out that actually there was a conference on this topic so many years later, and the book is just finished now. So what I want to say refers back to some of the discussions that have gone on this morning when people asked Steve, or you said actually, we have no time to develop the science, and many people have observed the fact that we don't know how to we don't no longer, or perhaps we never knew how to build bridges between science and policymakers and this whole dynamic. And that's really what this book is about, and I think we propose a solution for that, and I want to try to share some of that with you. And so the audience for the book is actually policymakers. It's not complexity scientists. It's really aimed at that community. And what we argue is that actually the problem's slightly different, perhaps, than the way it was framed this morning, is that we don't need more complexity science to be able to apply a complexity frame for policy. One of the problems, and I'll go into this in more details, but one of the problems with a lot of non-complexity science is that it overreached in its pretensions of what it is able to contribute to policy. And this is one of the great dangers for complexity science, is that it overreaches as well. But where I have a slightly different view than the discussion this morning is that actually that doesn't mean you have to wait for complexity science to be finished to actually apply a complexity frame in policy, and that's a really useful thing to do. So what we argue in the book is for the uncoupling of those things, that the science do the science, but at the same time create narratives that enrich the current policy narrative. So basically, I want to run through the following things. First, describe the policy narrative lock-in, and Rob alluded to it this morning. I think it's fairly familiar. And then say a little bit about how we actually got into this lock-in. And that's, I won't go into in great details, but in itself it's an extraordinary story of the ideas history of the 20th century, is how we ended up in this policy lock-in. Then go in how complexity policy provides a different narrative, so not a different science, but a different narrative. How it can change policy, and I'll end with some really concrete, detailed examples of how a policy would be different within a complexity frame than within the traditional frame. So the clearly, you know, the current policy debate, and it's most evident in the U.S., but it's actually true in many places, is stuck in two very strong narratives. One is Laissez-Faire, which is essentially a market fundamentalist perspective, which at some level looks a little bit like complexity, right? You say, the market fundamentalists say, let the thing organize itself and it'll go. But some of you have remarked already this morning that that's based on a big misunderstanding, because, you know, none of those markets actually they're social constructs, and they've been created in any case. The term laissez-faire is always interesting, is that, since we were into linguistics in the last talk, is that this was actually a reaction to a very strong state controlled under Colbert in France in the end of the 17th century. And the Minister of Finance, who famously observed that the point of taxation was to be able to pluck the goose and minimize the screaming. That was his definition. The largest amount of feathers with the least possible amount of hissing is the definition of proper taxation policy. But he was talking to a capitalist of the day and asking about his opinion, and he said, "Laissez-nous faire," and just let us be, and that was his policy recommendation. The other very strong narrative is the government activist one, which is more and strongly associated with the left. At least in Europe and in the US. In Asia, the story is a little bit different, and, you know, I'm solidly European, and I know that environment. I won't pretend to be able to comment on the situation in Asia. But, you know, the narrative about that the most effective way is for action from the government. And in fact, that ties into our education about how things happen, because there's a causality there, right? There's an actor who does something, and that leads to something. So that's a narrative that's appealing to many people. But the extraordinary thing that happened is that this polarization into left and right, and these two narratives about dynamics of change of laissez-faire and government activism, got mapped onto outcomes, right? Laissez-faire became a conservative thing, and government activists more a progressive or leftish, whatever you want to call it, which is a very strange situation, because they fundamentally describe dynamics of change, and in essence, the outcome of that is not necessarily tied to it, but that's the lock-in that has been created, and I'll say a little bit about how that lock-in came about. But that's kind of the key to the story, because we're mixing up outcomes and dynamics. And this is where the complexity frame can help us overcome that lock-in and expand the situation. So this is one image, but there could be many. Is if you look at all the societal problems that you could have, education, climate change, healthcare, what have you, it's framed typically in the debate either through the economics of control frame or through the market fundamentalist frame. And what we suggest is actually that there's such a thing as a complexity frame, again, not underpinned by science, but certainly inspired, just as these others actually aren't underpinned by science either, because there's a tremendous overreach between the science and the frame. So you have quite a symmetric situation. And the real point actually is to be able to have a dialogue about which frame is appropriate for which problem at which time. And we're not arguing for the fact that a complexity frame is better in any way. It's just an expansion of the way of looking at problems, and you have to learn, and there are situations in which a control frame is perfectly appropriate. And to be able to have that dialogue, but to have it uncoupled from the outcome that you desire. Within each of these frames, you can advocate a society that has a lower Gini coefficient or that is more environmental friendly. I mean, these things aren't necessarily tied to your theory or your conception of the dynamic of change in society. And I think that's a notable difference. So if we go back to if we go back into economics a little bit, and to be frank, economics in the 20th century has completely dominated social science, and certainly the bridge to policy. Archaeology, anthropology, psychology, etc., has been relatively marginalized, not in science, but certainly in the influence on policymakers, and therefore we look mostly at what the influence of economics has been on policy, and that has been arguably the strongest factor in creating this remarkable mapping between a dynamics and a set of outcomes. That wasn't always the case. I mean, this is a quote, slightly long quote, but worth reading, by Senior, who's one of a number of late 18th and early 19th century, we call them now economists. They only just called them economists at the time. And he very strongly emphasizes the fact that there's a difference between the conclusions that an economist comes to and the advice on policy, that those things should be very, very cleanly separated. And that was very much a part of the ethic at the time. And also, in a sense, an intellectual honesty, right? Because certainly at that time, and arguably even today, we really don't have a proper theory of economics in general. There's certainly pieces that are quite well understood. We know lots about jobs actually, and we can. But this idea that these things that the role of the advisor and the scientist should be clearly distinguished. Now, it can be the same person, but that person would have to be, in his or her interventions, clear whether he or she was speaking as a scientist or as somebody who had studied the matter but was venturing into the political side. So the classical narrative on policy was that there was no formal general model of the economy, which certainly didn't exist at the time, and the relationships between science and policy are too complicated in any case, and that policy derives from broader considerations, which includes ethics, theories of norms, psychology, all these things, and that models are actually incredibly important, but they're tools for solving particular problems as opposed to a general theory of the economy. And this changed, of course, with this gentleman who got pinned with a lot of the blame, but Walras, a French 19th century economist, who I understand was an interesting little story. He wasn't terribly good at school. He'd been rejected from Polytechnique and went into insurance or banking at some point, which in those days was a rather lowly profession. We've come full circle in some certain sense. And he was sort of sitting at home, and his father was a classical economist and had said, son, you should do something serious in your life. There are two problems in science that are unsolved. Why don't you go after one of these two? He said, there's no theory of history and there's no theory of economics. So he went after economics. And like many people in those days, he looked at physics. And in that time, only the first law of thermodynamics was known, closed energy systems, and not the second law of thermodynamics. And that wasn't his fault, obviously. But the foundation of general equilibrium theory, which much developed, obviously, in the decades afterwards, but fundamentally was based on that mapping from the first law of thermodynamics of closed systems. That is an extraordinary departure from the spirit that was there before. And this, in the early 20th century, and it's a very long story which we expose over quite a number of chapters, and I can't do justice to it here, but just from a historical perspective of how ideas develop, and start to have social impact, it is really quite an amazing trajectory of how this discipline went from an approach in the late 18th century to probably around the 20s and the 30s that a number of individuals, and Keynes I think was certainly one of them, who were very interested, were attracted to power and to want to be able to provide advice, and overreached in many ways. And I'm sure they were encouraged, so it's not right to blame blame those individuals, but a culture of very strong overreach was born, and that developed as the science developed and the models developed. Very limited models, but very sensible models. If you're going to, and I think it's the work's very impressive. If you're going to tackle a new discipline, something as complicated as the economy, it's perfectly reasonable to take a fairly narrow view, because that's the way you start with something. But it's the overreach into policy that then led to a number of competing theories within economics. Then led to this idea of a number of people who advocated market fundamentalism, and others a strong government control. And those became separate from the science. Those became narratives in the political domain, which we're all very familiar with. You don't need to know anything about economics to recognize those narratives, and a lot of politicians and policymakers live in them and use them. Now, obviously, economics, didn't stop there at all. So there's a lot of other things have happened and are going on still today, and some of them have been mentioned. Game theory, Ostrom's perspective on governance. We had INET was even this morning. Behavioral economics, agent-based models, and the open systems came in, but none of that, interestingly enough, was ever integrated into the stream of macroeconomic modeling, which is the thing that always had the strongest influence on policymakers. And I've done quite a lot of work on climate policy, and you're quite familiar, I'm sure, with these. The Stern report and others that predict that an aggressive climate policy will cost somewhere between 0.5% or 1% or 2% of GDP over the long term. The problem with those kinds of recommendations, again, is that you're trying to predict a model that's at best fit for incremental change, because it's a closed equilibrium model, and you're trying to apply it to a radical change where you're trying to reinvent your energy system and your transport system. So if you take apart the macroeconomic narratives on climate policy, it's another example of overreach where the advice doesn't come with a strong footnote, health warning, and saying, well, this actually is a very rudimentary understanding of the problem. It's useful to take into your consideration, but don't take this as the basis for your policy. Take it as one input and look at a number of others. And it's the lack of health warnings that has created this extraordinarily strong lock-in. And I think it's a warning for complexity science, and that there's a possibility to get to the same. And I think some of the people have alluded to it, because complexity as a science has got a hell of a long way to go. And that's great, that's important. There's the famous way to translate that is the famous Lamppost joke, where an economist was looking around under a lamppost because he had lost his key, and somebody said, well, did you lose your keys? And he said, no, but so it's not here, but so why are you looking here? Well, this is because this is where the light is. But actually, the conclusion that's often taken out of that joke is the wrong conclusion. It's actually sensible to look where the light is, because if you're going to look in the dark, you would absolutely never find the keys. The problem is that you think you're going to find the keys there. What you will find is understand the topology of the landscape. You'll get a sense of the dynamics in the piece under the light. And perhaps you can infer something about the the darkness through that search. So it's very sane to do that, but you have to do it with a certain humility and a consciousness of why you're looking in that place. And a lot of, particularly macroeconomics, I think, is in that place. It's looking where the light is, and that's the right thing to do. But then don't come with hard recommendations about where the keys are. Just say something about that, and it needs a number of extra skills which policymakers should bring to the table, which is opinion, hope, experience, ideals, and all these other things that should complement the scientific insights. So now, how would the complexity approach change the perspective? I'll skip over this, and this is the standard list of complexity stuff, right? All the elements that a complexity frame brings to the table. And in a complexity policy frame, you assume that the general model is too complicated, so that you don't have a general theory. You don't pretend that you have a general theory of the economy. You make models, but you're very upfront that the models aren't enough. And also, I think, as Rob argued for this morning, you don't view the government as something, and policymakers as something outside the system, but they're entirely inside the system. It's something that has co-evolved with the market and the economy, and in a certain sense has been a solution to the problems that have been on the table. The other thing is that social norms and tastes aren't given. They co-evolve with the system, and they're variable and they're influenceable. They can be influenced by the way the system evolves. And you don't recognize this polarity between fundamentalist and standard policy narratives. But you do a lot of mathematics, so none of this is an anti-science plea. It's actually a plea for more science. You should do more maths and more sophisticated maths. I think the physicists in the room will recognize that the maths that's done in economics aren't particularly sophisticated. So there's actually quite a long way to go in terms of doing more complicated stuff. But you just don't pretend that that's the absolute solution. So moving on now to a number of examples to get a sense of, so without the science, what would be different? How would you tackle particular problems? And the important thing is that you're shifting frame. So you're not shifting theory, but you're recognizing that you're looking at a different lens rather than a different explanation. And that, as we know from experience in all sorts of areas, is actually a very, very strong shift, particularly since many people are so stuck in the frame that they've adopted so far. And one of the so the narrative between the market fundamentalists and the government control perspective is very much about top down and bottom up. And the point of the complexity frame is that you don't view these things as being in contrast, but you view them as co-evolving, and you attempt, or at least you've got a certain sense of how they hold together. So a very simple example is which is always easily accessible, is from traffic, is that the classic control perspective is the traffic light, obviously, where you decide that you will give people no freedom, and you'll regulate when they drive and when they don't drive. And the bottom-up perspective, may be more a roundabout kind of thing, where you let things flow by themselves. But the complexity perspective is best illustrated by a traffic planner called Monderman, a Dutchman, one of the few Dutchmen who made the front page of the New York Times, I think. There are probably not that many. And he had this concept of shared space, and he was much more radical, because he said, and he's actually managed to convince some authorities in the Netherlands to construct this, is that you take out all traffic signs. You take out the sidewalks, the traffic lights, the signs, everything. You just make it an intersection in the city, one big flat area. And you let pedestrians and bicycles, etc., evolve around this space. But the key is that he didn't frame this as a free market, let it all rip story. This only works in the context of a set of social norms that you have in the Netherlands, that you have people having, proper driver's licenses, having lights, even though on bicycles it's a little spotty in the Netherlands, but that there's this whole context, and it's the interaction between the rules that are and the structure that's been given with the bottom-up, that allows the bottom-up organization to occur. But you're very explicit about the relationship of those two. And I taught a class 2 years ago at Sciences Po on complexity in public policy while writing the book, and I had a number of students from all over the world, and some of them from India said, "Oh, but this is the way it works in India. Nobody was." But the key difference is that there you get gridlock and dangerous situations. If you look at the situation in the applications in the Netherlands, the traffic flowed faster, and you had substantially fewer accidents, which of course is what you're after so you actually had a better system, and you can only understand why that system is better if you appreciate the interaction between the way the rules are set around the system and which allows the bottom-up dynamic to occur. And what the idea with the complexity narrative is that it allows that kind of a dialogue to occur. And some people argue that complexity is new and all of that, and of course that's nonsense. This is now a discipline that's 2 or 3 decades old. So there's really no excuse for policymakers or not to access, at least at a narrative level, the insights. You don't need to know all the science, but the principles, at least in our perspective, are strong enough to be able to support something that can frame policy discussions. Another example, a little bit in more detail, is this story of for-benefit corporations. This is a very interesting development in the U.S. and in a number of other countries, but it started in California. And the idea is similarly that there's a lock-in between for-profit corporations and charities. And that's having worked in for-profit companies for a long time, you also realize the complete disconnect between the narrative about profit maximization and what people actually do all day. Hardly anybody in a company ever gets up in the morning to profit maximize. That's probably true in some companies, and sometimes I suspect if the financial sector didn't filter all the people into it who actually are motivated by profit maximization. But that's pure speculation. But the narrative actually isn't neutral. It ends up coloring a lot of the behaviors and the choices and the emergent behavior of that organization, and you could probably go further in terms of continuing to create demand for products and manufacturing, the whole consumerism, you could see as something that has co-evolved with this invention of the for-profit model and the shareholder model, which is a Dutch invention, actually, about 400 years ago. And on the other side, you have charities, and I'm the chairman of the board of a charity, and I've worked with various ones. I set up the Shell Foundation, and when I was working there, and there, what you often observe is there's a confusion between intention and efficiency. So there's kind of a flavor of because we're doing good, we're doing the right thing, whereas the whole idea of being I thought if you're going to do this, I could interpret it as a Roman 5, but you got me on that. So you get, along with the model, you actually get a set of behaviors and outcomes. So these models are deeply influential for the type of activity, and we've divvied up our society in these two kind of activities. So the idea of for-benefit corporations is that you create a space for a different way of organizing is that you have companies that follow a commercial model but declare a non-profit maximization outcome. So you say, my goal is to, I don't know, set up a number of social housing projects, and I will do so at a 5% loss, which I will get from subsidies or donations, but I will manage myself to that 5%, and I'll try to beat that. It's a thoroughly commercial model, but you actually announce the goal that your organization is about. And the idea is that this is an example of policy through the complexity frame, because you're just opening a space within which people will be able to co-evolve, to evolve a set of new kinds of activities and the social norms that go in with them, both inside their organizations and outside. And you also realize that you'll get this wrong. I mean, it took hundreds of years to get the legal framework for commercial companies right. And for benefit corporations, the same thing. It has all sorts of fiscal and legal problems. And so one of the characteristics of policy in a complexity frame is that you know that you don't have the answer. So you start with something, and you very consciously move on from there. So just to summarize, in a sense, so this is the book is coming out at Princeton University Press later this year. So in a sense, there's a slight harking back to the old days, but it attempts to get back some of that flavor from the 19th century of making a very clear distinction between what we know scientifically and what are policy narratives that are useful, and to avoid that overreach, both in the existing frames, but also in the new complexity frame that you don't pretend to base on science. I think what gives me some sense of comfort that this is possible is that actually people are intuitively quite comfortable with thinking in a complexity frame, because that's where most of their life outside work actually is. When they talk about their friends or their family, etc., it's all in terms of this mix. Educating kids is, you perfectly understand the interaction between the top down and the bottom up. And one of the extraordinary things I saw earlier last year in the Netherlands, there was an election campaign, and there was one particular politician who took every time he was asked for a position on a certain policy issue, he said, "Listen, I can't tell you what I'm going to do exactly, because we're in a very turbulent environment. So I can tell you what my principles are, but how I will apply them in given situations, I promise to stick to my principles, but how it will work out, I can't tell you." And with this, he was a physicist. And with this extraordinary narrative, he doubled the votes to the party. Now that doesn't prove anything, but at least it suggests that voters aren't fools. They actually can recognize a real and a more sophisticated story. So the lock-in that politicians have gotten themselves into elections between these two narratives isn't necessarily a vote loser. That was the end of the story, actually.
Thank you very much. Okay, questions, remarks? Yes, please.
I'm curious if you think that some societies are simply ungovernable.
Well, no, I don't think so. Because what happens, if you think of government as an emergent phenomenon of the societies, they will have some system that emerges. What does happen is that some I don't think they're ungovernable, but they can get into really nasty phases. So and that, the classic cases are Syria, etc. That have. But in a sense, it's because tensions have been allowed to build up for too long. That's also a much given explanation for the First World War, for example, is that it's a set of pent-up tensions in society without a release mechanism, and then it really gets into a rather awful phase. So I don't think anything's fundamentally ungovernable, but it can be pretty hard to recover, absolutely.
Why are you asking this question?
I'm asking the question because I'm observing, and I think this conference in many ways is reinforcing an observation that as I have at least worked with policymakers in the United States, which has not been an easy task, finding frames, any kind of frame for policymaking, is very difficult. In fact, perhaps impossible when you have groups of people, groups of policymakers who have diametrically opposed philosophies. And I think in many ways the partisanship that at least we are currently experiencing in the United States has at its root some of the philosophical differences that make it very, very tough to include a frame like bottom up and top down together. And in many ways, the frame that I've started to, the only frame that I have been finding useful lately is almost a getting to yes, using peace processes amongst, you don't tell them it's a peace process, but that's really what you're doing. You're trying to find the little bit of common ground that you can build upon to create, shared visions of a different future. And I just was curious, how he would perceive that.
Well, but that's, I think, so I recognize that that's extraordinarily difficult, but it's made more difficult by the perceived scientific justification. So it's great that people have, that's important, diametrical views on how they want society be structured, etc. And David and I see things quite differently. We have different views on politics, but it allows you to separate the discussion on the outcomes you desire from a discussion on what the best means are to get there. And that's the one thing that would be rather helpful from the scientific perspective, if those health warnings came with some of the science to saying, it's fine to accept, to believe in government control or in market fundamentalism, but don't believe somehow that those things are scientifically true to deliver everything. And that's a misunderstanding that needs to be deconstructed. And I think that would make probably the debate easier, because if you separate the debate on outcomes from the means,
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Okay. Okay.
Good,
Stephen.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a good answer,
All right,
Stephen.
thank you. I get my, no.
As a physicist, for you, complexity is nonlinear dynamics. Right? And economics and most of social science is about linear systems. So there's been an ongoing kind of uncomfortable, there's been a building tension about that. For years, Doan Farmer was unable to get papers published in economics journals because statistical mechanics, it doesn't fit the framework, right? So I'm asking, you've got a unique perspective working as a theoretical physicist also in this area of public policy. And I want to triangulate it, and my question should become clear. The other thing is, over the years, we almost immediately after complexity was developed, there was an interest from the business community and also public policy, giving complexity a kind of a normative flavor, that it's a good thing, right? And I think you ended by saying that complexity is something that we recognize as part of the world that we live in. So to me, those three ideas are in tension, right? The economists, the political scientists, or the public policy people, and then the physicists. But you're now right in the center of that. So I wonder how you portray a kind of a rather, a lack of tension between those ideas, and I wonder if, as a physicist, you find the other two views a little troubling.
I find that the absoluteness of the methods, so the outcome, again, if people hold extreme views, then and those are political beliefs, then that's great. You should debate them and have a beer, etc. But it's the pretense of scientific foundation that's problematic, and also why, and I've had my share of the challenge. I mean, interesting enough, economics is a lot like astrophysics. Which was I experienced when I graduated, that astrophysicists don't accept that the universe is fractal, even though the star catalogs are incredibly clear that it is fractal, and it's just cognitive dissonance at a massive scale. And so this is what people do collectively; they get themselves into this. But the reason we wanted to write the book was, and these things only have a hugely limited influence, of course. Was to make that point that by all means disagree about these things, but uncouple it from the science and realize how a freak of history, in a sense, it is that we ended up with these two polarized dynamics. And I think if people were to realize that, it would free up quite a lot of you still wouldn't agree, but you then could have a more constructive dialogue about how you would go about achieving the thing you wanted to achieve. And you could also even help somebody who you don't agree with figuring out what the optimal strategy would be.
Song Ji-young, I'm a political scientist from Singapore Management University with a first degree in mathematics. So I move across different fields. My colleague called me, I have a weird background. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm interested to hear from theoretical physicists. I have a flatmate, a former flatmate who's doing theoretical physics, and I asked him when we were doing a PhD both in Cambridge. He didn't tell me anything about complexity theory. So I asked him quite recently, what is complexity theory? And he said, I don't do complexity theory. I do complex theory. So it was he was saying that complexity theorists, they're sort of doing the popular scientists. They're not really a real scientist. They're doing all this sort of popular science. So he was very dismissive of all this passing fad of complexity sciences. My question is more fundamental about how to approach public policy from complexity thinking. And I think the fundamental question is that complexity theory has to answer who self-organizes. Robert Dahl, who's a political theorist, he asked this same question, who governs? And his answer was, everyone does. And I've been listening to and reading complexity thinking over the past year, and I can pick up some different versions of complexity science. Some says the Elinor Ostrom kind of self-organization and decentralization theory is complexity theory. Others say what Axtell is doing the ABM of firms is more like a corporatist use of complexity theory. Some other people say, postmodernism, post-positivism, and post-structuralism is similar. The theory in social sciences using complexity theory. So I'm just wondering whether you can answer who self-organizes using complexity theory in public policy. As I can pick up from your title that you're suggesting this democracy theory or decentralization theory of complexity theory in public policy. But what you're actually suggesting in your talk is that you're actually doing both top-down and bottom-up approach together. So if you can clarify which version of complexity science or complexity theory you're using for your study of public policy.
So let me first say that I'm not a theoretical physicist, other than I studied it many decades ago. So I've been a businessman in the meantime and some other things, but I remember some of it. So, complexity theory, whatever it is, and it's not very cleanly defined, and that's a good thing, because that's a sign of a living discipline, I think, is nowhere near being able to answer the questions that you pose. And, I think the models that Rob is trying to make, and Carlo Jaeger is doing something similar of modeling the German economy and ABM, is incredibly important work. But to pretend that it's at a stage where you can give policy advice at this point is presumptuous, and it's also wrong. And science should be let to, this will take 10 years, 20, I don't know, or maybe we never get there. So what I'm really pleading for is to decouple these things. Is there's enough we understand about the organizing principles of how things co-evolve and the combination of top-down, that you can use it to top-down and bottom-up, that you can use it to justify and enrich the political narratives, just as the others, the government control and the market fundamentalists, also don't have a theory that underpins them, at least not to the level that is pretended. So we're kidding ourselves, and it's incredibly important to, in a sense, to recognize and be comfortable with the level of uncertainty that exists in public policy. There's lots of stuff we don't know, so we'll need to use other methods, such as foresight, as being done next door, and there are all these other tools. But the scientific answer to these questions doesn't exist.
But you did something. You gave a picture.
Angela's waving. Sorry, but you want.
Oh, so Angela, you get your. Yeah, but there was you had these 3 dimensions. The one was nationalistic programs, I think, or and then it was
this.
No, yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Economics of control, and this is a very important one, and that's a very important one.
But
And
they're
now you're
framed-
suggesting at least this will become a very important thing.
It should become an important thing, but what I keep saying is that these aren't underpinned by science.
No way, of course.
And these are pretended to be. I mean, there is science underneath, just like there's under complexity. There's amazing stuff.
Yeah.
But just to say that that this is completely a scientific thing is untrue, and in fact, it's proven by the fact that you find economists who argue both, right? So that demonstrates that there's no theory. So
Okay.
it is. Giving uncertainty its place in policy is being very clear that there are lots of things that are uncertain, and you have to take a view based on experience and then have an adaptive process to correct as you go along.
But these 2 are very powerful frames, aren't
Yes.
they? Have developed as powerful frames.
Yeah.
You even can't get rid of these economists, and you can't even, so to say. They're so prominent. And now you say that must occur too with the complexity frame. It should be a powerful.
No, I'm actually saying you should make the roots of these weaker and add that one. That's the point.
Okay.
Unless you make the roots of those weaker, complexity frame will never live, because people will say, well, this is really solid science, and that's just new stuff.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
anyway, Angela.
No microphone, but I can shout. So I'm a frame girl, so I like to frame. But the challenge I have, the issue I want to bring to the table is just to make sure this isn't supply side into policy only, right? So now we're changing the input side into policy because we're thinking about the system differently as we bring things. I would suggest, you might have thought of this, each of these frames will use the word adaptation, but to mean a different type of learning style.
Yep.
So you could say one of them's loop 1, one's loop 2, and one's loop 3 type learning. And so that have you thought about that type of piece?
So these frames they have associated with them a theory of change and adaptation, etc. But the plea is that if you cut them loose from their very solid scientific foundations, it opens the space for those kinds of things, is that you start thinking about how to deal with uncertainty and error in those, because they're now so loaded with pretense and certainty in the political debate. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why people get so stuck, is because they have this sense of, the weight of certainty behind them, and that's, that's just unhelpful.
Last question.
Very small question. Do you think we can learn from history in terms of making decisions, policy decisions?
Well, that was the other thing Walras could have gone on and answer that question. But he picked economics, and I have no idea.
No, but that might not be the same. So.
Well, that would be a theory of history if you.
No. So my question is, if you want to, push policy making forward, does what has happened have an influence on the way you learn how to do that?
Well,
In other words, can we learn from history?
In policy making.
Things that have happened before, in policies that were implemented before, and measuring their effect, can we learn from that?
Did Ben Bernanke learn from the Depression?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, no, absolutely. But you to a certain extent, and things will always be different. And all the processes that Kahneman describes about lock-in and all sorts of cognitive issues also come at play here. So yes, and so Bernanke learned from that. But if you look at Greenspan,
Why is he asking such a question? Can we learn of history?
Yes.
That's a rhetoric question. Why is he asking that?
Right, ask him. Why did you ask him?
Why are you asking such a question?
I'll tell you later.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And,